context, the parallels between the two time periods are worth emphasizing as a counterpoint to the generally accepted Western view that often interprets political Islam as a unique, peculiar ideology rooted in the alleged unchanging cultural essence of the Muslim world. In reading about the religious zealotry of John of Leyden and his followers in Münster, Germany, one is today reminded of various Islamist groups in the Middle East today, especially the rise of ultra-conservative Salafist movements in Tunisia and in Egypt. The parallels are striking, and in significant ways the similarities between both groups outweigh their differences, both in terms of the political motivations of the actors, the social idiom in which they express themselves, and also the religious, political, and historic context in which they lived. When comparing religiously inspired protest movements in Europe in the 16th century with those in the Middle East or North Africa at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, two observations are worth noting. Democracy and human rights in the West did not emerge from political documents, but rather they emerged from human struggle. Europe has indeed traveled a very long way over the course of the last 500 years in terms of its own political development. Any objective attempt to explore the problems of democracy and political development in non-Western societies, in Muslim-majority societies in particular, requires a rethinking of the very long and torturous history and struggle for democracy in the West. Secondly, on a related point, I caution you all to be wary of the tendency to read history backwards instead of forwards. What do I mean by that? There is often an implicit assumption in much of the commentary and debate about the Muslim world today and its many political problems that in comparison that we in the West have always been liberal, have always been tolerant, have always been democratic, and that you can draw a straight line from ancient Athens to 21st century Belgium, for example. But as the historian Mark Mazur has noted in his very important book, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, it is wrong to see Europe as the natural home of freedom and democracy. Rather, the last 100 years in Europe was frequently a nightmarish laboratory for social and political engineering, inventing and reinventing itself through war, revolution, and ideological competition. Fascism and communism, Professor Mazur argues, should be regarded not as exceptions to the general rule of democracy, but as alternative forms of government that attracted millions of Europeans by offering different solutions to the challenges of the modern world. By 1940, the prospects for democratic government looked very bleak, and Europe's future seemed to lie in Hitler's hands. I think these are sobering reminders for a European audience trying to make sense today of the problems of non-Western societies and their struggles with political development and modernization. Now let me turn to this theme of modernization and its relationship to Islamic fundamentalism. And by modernization, I often ask my students, what does modernization mean? Very few people can give me a coherent answer, but I think modernization can be understood in its most basic terms as simply the replacing of the old with the new. In this case, the replacing of old patterns of thought with new patterns of thought. The replacing of old conceptions of social relationships with new ones. The replacing of old sort of sources of legitimate authority with new sources of legitimate authority. That's really the process of modernization in its most basic element. Now, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism at the end of the 20th century was a very baffling development for many observers of the Middle East. And this seemed to confirm the worst stereotypes and prejudices and views about Islam and Muslims. Because after all, how could large numbers of people in the age of secular reason at the end of the 20th century identify in such a profound way with a deeply conservative version of religion as a primary source of their identity? This not only challenged the received wisdom from the Enlightenment, and much of social science theory, but it also gave credence to, it gave legitimacy to, a very essentialist and reductive interpretation of Muslim politics. It was a baffling question, and two people who sort of emerged at the beginning of this debate, who tried to interpret this broad phenomenon of Islamic fundamentalism, who were very influential, both in social sciences and in the intellectual culture, and much later in terms of policy formation in the United States, was the historian Bernard Lewis and his student Martin Kramer. The prevailing interpretation by this group of thinkers on the question of Islamic fundamentalism and why it emerged in the Islamic world as opposed to liberal democracy, this interpretation often sought to explain this social phenomenon by focusing on the unique civilizational peculiarities and idiosyncrasies of Islam. Despotism, it was alleged, is at the very core of the Muslim faith, as it demanded submission both to God and to those who ruled in his name. If one, for example, reads today the writings of a very popular author, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a darling and a popular figure here in the West among both liberals and conservatives, one certainly gets this view. In an oft-cited cliche about Islam, it is alleged that Islam does not recognize a separation between religion and politics, but it is a total way of life. The implication being that a totalitarian political system is somehow the natural state of affairs for Muslim societies. Bernard Lewis has sought to explain and has given a reason for why liberal democracy did not emerge in the Muslim world by arguing that from the very beginning Islam discouraged the formation of independent groups that might challenge despotic rule. In what is today an often mainstream view, the problems of Muslim society are to be located in medieval Islamic history. Islamic law, Professor Lewis has written, knows no corporate legal persons. Islamic history shows no councils or communes, no synods or parliaments of any kind, or elected representative assemblies. The political experience of the Middle East under the caliphs and sultans, says Professor Lewis, was one of almost unrelieved autocracy, in which obedience to the sovereign was a religious as well as a political obligation, and disobedience a sin as well as a crime. His student, Martin Kramer, is the author who works within this same intellectual framework. And in discussing modern Middle Eastern history, he wrote, quote, "Of the many forms of fundamentalisms that have emerged within Islam in recent years, perhaps none has had so profound an impact on the human imagination as Hezbollah, the Party of God." In attempting to explain the political behavior of this particular militant organization, he wrote, quote, "More than any other fundamentalist movement in recent history, Hezbollah evoked the memory of the medieval assassins who have been feared in the West and in the Islamic world for their marriage of fierce militancy with destructive deeds," end quote. Now the linking of the activities of Hezbollah, a late 20th century militant organization, with the 12th century assassins that once existed in the Islamic world is a typical interpretation of the modern politics of the Islamic world used by this group of scholars, as if to suggest that the more complex modern forces of demographic shifts, economic disparity, cultural transformation, and foreign intervention are not worth taking into account. In a response to Martin Kramer's analysis of Hezbollah, Juan Eduardo Campo at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in a very strong response to Martin Kramer, has written, quote, "One can only imagine the objections that will be raised if a respected American studies scholar were to interpret Chicano or African-American gang activity in American cities today in terms of ancient Aztec or African warrior religions, while neglecting to discuss the more immediate social, cultural, and economic causes of this activity." And Campo's comment here on the modern socio-economic crisis of state and society in the Middle East and its relationship to the emergence of religious fundamentalism, I think merits some consideration and some investigation as an alternative reading of the problems of Muslim political development. As a side note, Campo also mentions in this context, in terms of his response to Martin Kramer, that one thing that Martin Kramer completely ignores in terms of the rise of Hezbollah was that it omits the most immediate and fundamental cause that led to the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, and that was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and American complicity with it. But that's on a side note, and that's really a reflection of the gaping hole that exists within this brand of scholarship, where the problems of politics in the Islamic world are really all about the alleged inherent inner workings of Islamic civilization, US foreign policy, Western foreign policy, the legacy of European colonialism, has nothing to do with it. Let's just move on now to this question of modernity, the malaise of modernity and its relationship to political Islam. While Islamic fundamentalism is often considered to be an exclusively Muslim phenomenon, it's important to acknowledge that all of the major religions have experienced this form of conservative social piety. The fact that it first emerged in the West, recall the story that I just told about Munster, Germany, is not accidental, given that it was in Europe and later the United States where the process of modernization had its initial and most consequential impact. The momentous transformation of societies and cultures over the last 2 centuries has profoundly altered the way human beings relate to one another and view the world around them. In the 20th century in particular, there has been a discernible shift away from large extended families and a group-based identity towards a more individual-centered existence. The passing away, the withering away of traditional society has included a weakening of parental authority, greater political rights for women, and the questioning and challenging of religious authority. While these trends are not visible in equal magnitude in every country, they do exist in varying degrees across most societies, and they are intimately and deeply connected to what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has termed the malaise of modernity. Modernity has been identified with an increase in social problems and higher divorce and crime rates, alcohol and drug addiction, nerve disorders, and family breakdowns. This social crisis, or this set of social crises, has given rise in troubled times to basic questions of identity that can help navigate the individual and his or her community through the troubled waters of the modern age. It's an observable fact that throughout human history, that during times of great social transformation and political upheaval, a natural side effect is the revival of religion. During the Mongol occupation of Russia in the 13th and 14th century, for example, the Orthodox Church is reported to have experienced one of its greatest periods of growth. And we had a similar phenomenon in the United States in the mid-19th century as a result of the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Stated simply, social upheaval engenders a reaction where one often seeks stability and security by a return to the basic and the familiar. Muslim societies, I think, are no different in this regard. And writing specifically about the Muslim reaction to modernity, political scientist James Piscatori perceptively has observed, quote, Muslims are in a sense looking for what Daniel Bell has called new rights of incorporation, which link today's deracinated individual to a community and a history. And yet, in another sense, they are looking for rather old rights of incorporation that appear to be new even as they are familiar. Religion, precisely because in the past it answered questions about life and death, and it provided its followers with moral links to each other, becomes the means by which individuals hope to answer a new question of what it is, what does it mean to be modern, and in doing so to perhaps gain a reassuring common worldview. In this respect, Piscatori states, born-again Christians and veiled-again Muslims are responding to the same broad social phenomenon. Now, a target of most fundamentalist groups in all religions is this theme of secularism. In particular, the consumer-oriented culture of materialism that is identified with our secular age. These movements tend to be generally literalist when it comes to interpreting sacred scripture and critical readings of religion and critical reading of religious texts are generally viewed as heretical. And just a quote from a popular saying among Islamic activists that you often hear, Kullu bida'atin dalala. Translation, all innovation is forbidden. What fundamentalist groups seek to do is to drag God from the sidelines and to place religion at the center of social and public debate. Every fundamentalist movement that I have studied, notes the famous author and public intellectual Karen Armstrong, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is rooted in a profound fear of annihilation, a conviction that somehow the liberal secular establishment wants to wipe out religion. This is true of militant Christian groups in the United States, as it is of Muslim socially conservative groups in Egypt and Iran. The need to, quote, defend religion, or in this case defend Islam, is a common argument often espoused by Islamic fundamentalists, indicating a sincere belief that somehow they feel that their religion is under assault. Fundamentalists believe that they are fighting for survival, and when people feel that their backs are to the wall, they will lash out violently like a wounded animal, notes Karen Armstrong. Secondly, fundamentalist movements generally tend to be evangelists, whose primary audience are really members of their own faith, who are deemed to have gone astray and who lack sufficient piety to attain personal salvation. They're not generally interested in global conquest or spreading their religion around the world. They are generally against, fundamentalist groups are generally against the idea of pluralism in matters of faith, and they firmly believe that there is only one correct school or a limited number of correct schools of interpretation of religion, scripture, and law. Significantly, it's important to point out that these movements are not traditional in the sense that they are not trying to roll back the clock to some pristine age and to disengage completely with the modern world, like the Amish Christians have done in the United States, or like Hasidic Jews have done in the United States. But rather, most mainstream fundamentalist movements are very modern, both in terms of the values that they are reacting against, and in terms of how they are very comfortable with using modern technology to support their own activities. They send their students and children to post-secondary modern educational schools, and they tend generally to live very urban lifestyles. This is most apparent if one looks at the educational background of many adherents of these fundamentalist groups, who tend to come disproportionately from the applied sciences, engineering, and medicine, where the answers are precise and the formulas exact. Ambiguous meanings, multiple correct responses, shades of gray, an appreciation for nuance is not part of their intellectual or professional training. And their response to contemporary social and political questions is often informed by this cognitive rigidity. In commenting on the parallel processes of religious resurgence in societies around the world, scholars have noted that there is a deep connection between the rise of fundamentalist movements and the recent wide global assertion and interconnection of our planet. In other words, globalization, in other words, based on fundamental changes in technology from the media age to the information age, has through a media revolution greatly heightened awareness about previously segmented and isolated populations. And this concept of identity, if you think about it, is relational. We identify ourselves in relationship to other groups. And the more that we are aware of the plurality of groups in our world, this forces a question. What is distinct about me and my community in this very globalized world? And if you're familiar with the debate on this subject, about 20 years ago, Benjamin Barber wrote a very influential book precisely on this topic called Jihad versus the World, where he argued this precise point, that the rise of ethnic